now welcome Liana Borghi, who, as well as being a member of the advisory board, is a long-term friend.
Hello, thank you, Jaime, and thank you all for having me here. I am going to take you elsewhere. After Federica, whom I thank especially for something that I needed, I am going to take you elsewhere. And I'll start, let me put my glasses on. I'll start by telling you that the title of my paper, my short 15-minute paper, is Ghosting the Queer. And I presented it, as you can read it, by saying that Karin Barad's quantum queerness and her work on the emergence of entangled agencies has opened new possibilities in queer studies at a time when other neo-materialist feminist thinkers are discounting the discursive bias of queer theory. I wish to address the ghosting of queer theory as a rather misguided reading of queer practices and positive agential interactions, and to point out that queer spectrology and ontology have much to contribute to studies of emotion and other processes of affective production. This is what I wish to present. I'm not sure that what I'm going to read follows exactly. I begin by clarifying my use of terms, because as I was talking to some of you, I realized that some of my words were not common currency among us. So, queer is well known as a political positionality, methodological framework, or system of knowledge production. But let me say briefly that in the 1980s, a whole generation ago, the word queer came to indicate in the USA, Great Britain, and later in many countries, Spain included, a movement differing from gay and lesbian identity politics, but still opposed to public cultures organized for the promotion of a dominant and explicit heterosexuality. What many of us have learned from it was that gender, homosexuality, ethnicity, and race are performatives produced and activated by the representations we give and receive of them, and that we should feel responsible and accountable for the ways we discuss and represent them cross-culturally. In queer theory, the declared instability of gender and sexual norms became a porous, malleable, unstable ground on which alternative performances could be replicated, unlearned, and reinvented. Nowadays, queer politics, open to sympathizing heterosexuals as usual, continue to discourage self-identity and closure, opening wide possibilities for disturbance of the familiar, disaffection, and disruption to processes of materialization. Is there a problem? Yeah. So in disruption to processes of materialization that promote boundaries and fixity. Noreen Giffney and Myra Hurd, editors of a collection of essays on queering the non-human, write that the unremitting emphasis in queer theoretical work on fluidity, über-inclusivity, indeterminacy, indefinability, unknowability, the preposterous, impossibility, unthinkability, unintelligibility, meaninglessness, and that which is unrepresentable is an attempt to undo normative entanglements and fashion alternative imaginaries. Furthermore, for the contribution to the volume that include Karin Barad and Luciana Parisi, queer functions variously as an interpolating gesture that calls on them to resist, reclaim, invent, oppose, define, make trouble for, open up, enrich, facilitate, disturb, produce, undermine, expose, make visible, critique, reveal, move beyond, transgress, subvert, unsettle, challenge, celebrate, interrogate, counter, provoke, and rebel. Now, you see why Metabody has something to do with this. This quote may explain what has led me to decide what a short statement on the presence of queer theory in the Metabody context would be appropriate. Queer studies have spread to many disciplines and cultural fields, keeping a close check on sexuality, but also authorizing forms of affective dissent and political resistance on many levels. Queer theories now feed into local associations, groups, and international networks that intersect with pacifist, ecological, anti-capitalist, anarchist situations, discussing insolvency, unemployment, and practicing solidarity, mutual aid, commonalities. In these difficult times, and not only in Italy, queer priorities have shifted from sexual arrangements to real-life entanglements, trying to organize material networks and micro-activities connected with primary needs. To make a very long story very short for the sake of this session, I will say for those unfamiliar with the subject that the early queer studies were shaped by 3 American women, Eve Sedgwick, Teresa de Lauretis, and Judith Butler, who still very profitably honed our thinking and our politics. 4 other women are also characters of my narrative. Sarah Ahmed, professor of race and cultural studies at Goldsmiths, author of Queer Phenomenology, Orientations, Objects, Others. Rosie Braidotti, director of the Center for the Humanities at Utrecht University, author of the just published The Posthuman. And 2 others just mentioned who are on our scientific committee, Luciana Parisi, professor of cultural studies at Goldsmiths, author of Abstract Sex, Philosophy, Biotechnology, and the Mutations of Desire, as well as more recent studies on nanotechnologies, and Karin Barad, professor of feminist studies, philosophy, and history of consciousness at Santa Cruz, author of Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning, all 4 of them important to new materialism and posthuman studies. My second word is ghosting. Ghosting is a term borrowed not from technology, where it describes the disambiguation of an image on TV, but from a book by Terry Castle, where she describes how lesbian sexuality has been made invisible in literature and history, how for centuries lesbians have been ghosted, kept out of sight, if not out of mind, although many have surfaced to tell their life stories. Here I also use another term, haunting, denoting the spectral sense of the past in the present, the persistent and troubling reappearance of felt presence of something long gone or dead. Traces left by past events in single or collective memory and history, a virtual noise, an abstract shape of the future, a strange simultaneity, a blurring and distorting technique which evidences gaps in the seamless surface of reality. In other terms, along the space-time continuum, memory haunts. It solicits the actual and the virtual to come to awareness. Because the presentation of the Metabody project addresses, as you have read, questions of sexuality and of minoritarian positions, among other things, I have been concerned that queer studies and politics not be ghosted in our posthuman entanglement of technology, theory, and the arts in performance. So I'm here to speak of 2 things. One that troubles me, the other that pleases me very much, both connected with the transition into new materialism and posthuman studies that is giving a new asset to queer theories. The troubling one first. Feminism has had its sex wars in the distant past, and I look at the new materialist wars with some amusement and more dismay. For a while now, there have been several attacks on Judith Butler's basic gender theory, attacks quoting her writings of her early 90s as if she had written nothing else since. Attacks that ghost the epochal theoretical and political turn that we largely owe her. Obviously, some critics are marking third territory for themselves, laying claim, some to new materialism, others to the posthuman, and this also partly explains Sarah Ahmed's defendants of feminism, herself included, from the accusations of being anti-biological and social constructionist, i.e., that is, considering the biological and the social as two separate spheres, translatable as accusations of vetero-poststructuralism, not attentive to the material semiotic reconceptualization of matter. And to this exchange is dedicated an open forum, practically a whole 2008 issue of the European Journal of Women's Studies. Troubling dynamics of continuity and discontinuity in processes of change, of paradigms in this case, are to be expected. But I hoped that the matter was closed, at least as far as the criticism to Butler was concerned. And this largely thanks to a reconceptualization of sex and queer sexuality by Luciana Parisi, published that same year in an essay on the nano-engineering of desire. But apparently it is not so if two books coming out of Utrecht are policing the boundaries of new materialism again. The main attack on Butler covers a couple of points which would not seem mortal sins in a reparative assessment, although in some neo-materialist quarters they are helping consign queer theory to obsolescence. One point charges Butler's queerness of destabilizing or soliciting the normative, exposing a perturbability at the heart of all normative structuration. A sure sign for Claire Colebrook and for Braidotti that Butler considers heteronormativity the primal power matrix. But of course I have to interpolate that Braidotti has probably forgotten Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, a book written before hers in the 90s, in the late 80s, the 90s. And that over the years, multiple other power mechanisms of capture have been identified, enabling multiple forms of resistance. The argument, however, highlights two different Foucaultian and Deleuzian approaches. For Butler, the social field is run through by strategies. For Braidotti, it is full of lines of flight, enabling transversal thinking beyond limits. A second point, which is made against Butler, is her mistaken emphasis on the performative techniques for undoing gender, performing it to death in order to reveal its arbitrary construction and to help deconstruct gender-sex identifications. Again, according to Braidotti, Butler sees gender as a transhistorical matrix of power instead of, as she should, considering it the mere historical capture of the multiple potentialities of the body, its generational and reproductive capacities. For Braidotti's vitalist materialism, and for other neo-materialist feminists, Butler's approach to gender is a discursive strategy that does not produce material effects. Such is not, however, my experience, as you can imagine. And it does not please me to see this arbitrary interpretation of queer studies that have used deconstruction techniques, another still widely used obsolete discursive strategy, not just for textual analysis, but to investigate material epistemologies and to subvert rather than to uphold counter-identity formations. There are a couple of crucial pages in Braidotti's Posthuman in which she gives some methodological guidelines attuned to her politics that, however, have been standard queer practice for years, such as accountability, use of creative figurations, non-linearity, defamiliarization, and others. If it is plausible, as she says, that posthumanism will not be captured by normative heterosexuality, this will not happen by refusing to see the evil worldwide effects of the system, but by taking stock of the multiple mechanisms of capture and by devising multiple forms of resistance. Enough to say now that queer theory and queer studies have given much thought to the material plasticity of the body and to hormone and surgical body control. I quote here, since we are in Madrid, Beatriz Preciado, who has lectured and written about experiments and practices to affect body changes, as well as about current trends of drag, postpone, or extreme makeovers. In Preciado's posthuman focus on embodiment, matter is alive, and it responds. One of the indictments against Butler, as we have seen, was due to her use of performativity. So to end, I would like to look at Karen Barad's use of performativity, a concept that travels from Sylvan Tompkins to Eve Sedgwick to Butler and on to quantum theory, meeting this time the full approval of feminist new materialists and posthuman theorists. From Barad's situated perspective, the queerness of performativity does not apply to human interactions in the world, but also to the intra-actions of the world. In her view, queer theory leaps from the human to the non-human, rearticulating matter to extend performativity as a dynamics of world differentiation, shifting the notion of sexuality from the discursive to the physical discursive, and enacting, quote, a renewed psychodiscursive production of sex. A very interesting development for queer theory, really. But there is a not so recent coda to this in Luciana Parisi's essay on the nano engineering of desire, which I mentioned earlier. In Parisi's wisdom, Butler's and Barad's positions are a posteriori actions that need to be connected to abstract activities of relationality, to the indistinct zones between thinking and doing, philosophical concept and technoscientific function, in order to rethink the ontology of queer sexuality and sexual difference in the current climate of technoscientific experimentation as an ontogenic variation of material desire. That is, through Spinoza, Deleuze and Guattari, Bergson and Whitehead, on to nanotechnology, bringing the abstract activities of atomic sexes as fully part of the material experience of sexuality. Parisi's reading shows how profitable are reparative readings that combine and knowledge expand. So now new sexual territories are available to our minds and bodies, open to possible disruptions and to rethink, I quote again, links between materialism, agency, chance of improvement, but still leaving us wondering, as Rachel does, and I quote Rachel, what forms of articulation and disarticulation could be possible and necessary. Now, at the end of all this, you may have noticed that ghosting came up in my paper, but no haunting reference to studies of emotion and other processes of affective production were mentioned. Those I leave for the next meeting of my cluster, of my Metabody cluster of on affect. But in the meantime, you may be interested in reading Barad on the ghostly matter of quantum leaps. She quotes, I quote her, a particularly queer kind that troubles the very dichotomy between discontinuity and continuity. This display of an array of uncanny phenomena, she writes, is actually quantum queerness. And I don't mean simply strange. Q is for queer, the doing and undoing of identity. Quantum continuity and discontinuity is at the crux of a possible and impossible, passable and impassable formation and transformation. Thank you.